Happy birthday, Miss Megan. Oh, sorry, that's a preschool thing. Here you go, Sylvia. Thank you. I thought I had a message that I didn't know about. I'm so glad that you were up here. Yes. Okay. But Miss Megan, happy birthday anyway. Hey, I've got a couple of helpers that are going to come up here to help me with the story of Daniel real quick. And so, and that's why Sylvia's up here right now anyway. So Oakley and Fielder, would you come up? Is it okay? Can you guys come up here? Come on up here. There you go. Hey, Fielder, is today a special day? Oh, Fielder's a little, okay. This is a little frightening being in front of all you, so be nice, okay? All right. So is it your brother's birthday today? Is it tomorrow? Oh, tomorrow is Fielder's birthday. So Fielder's going to be 4, right?
Yes.
4. Yes. All right. Awesome. Well, hi, Fielder. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate you coming up. So, all right. Let me get balanced here. So, can you guys tell me about the Daniel and the lion's den? Do you remember anything about that story?
Yes.
What do you remember? You want to tell me? Go ahead, Oakley.
That he got thrown into the lion's den.
He got thrown into the lion's den. Okay. Do you remember anything else, Fielder?
Yeah.
What?
He threw into the lion's den.
He was thrown into the lion's den. Very good. Do you remember anything else about that story, Oakley? No, he doesn't remember anything else about it. So he was thrown into the lion's den. Fielder, do you remember anything else about that story?
No.
No. Okay. So, do you think that Daniel was rescued from the lion's den?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Do you remember how that happened?
God shut the lion's mouth.
God shut the lions' mouths. Okay. Very good. Do you have anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah.
What? Nothing. Okay. All right. So, very good. Thank you so much for helping with that story. I appreciate that. So, give them a hand. Okay. You guys can go ahead and sit down with your mom. Okay. Very good. So, you never know what you might get, right? Okay. I think it's good. It's good for us to realize that our kids are they're a part of this worship together with us, and so let them play a part. And it's exciting to be able to see that for us. And while it may be scary for them, they may have felt like they were just delivered from the lion's den. I don't know. But I think it's good for them to be a part of that with us and for us to see that. So my slides are up here. Okay, good. So they told us a little bit about the story, but we want to go a little bit more in depth in the story this morning. All right? So that's what we're going to do. Now, I want to give you some context and just some background information, and it's stuff that you've already heard, but I want to bring us up to speed. And I want you to think about something as we go through this story. I want you to think, and I'm not going to be talking about this specifically, okay? But I do want you to be thinking about how does Daniel's life compare with Jesus? I don't know if you've ever thought about that before, but think about this story that we have of Daniel. And how does that compare with Jesus' experiences? Okay? And if you have any questions about that, you can talk to me about it afterward. But we're going to be focusing on the story itself and what are the things that we can learn from that. So if you remember, we began at the beginning of Daniel where they were taken. Daniel was taken from Jerusalem, and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as we know them, were taken from Jerusalem, as well as a lot of other Jews, because the kingdom of Judah had disobeyed God. And they were taken out of Jerusalem, conquered by the Babylonians, and taken into Babylon, where they were actually going to be trained to serve the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. And in the sermons that Mitch has talked about previously, what we discover is they were told about the ways of the Babylonians. They were taught about the literature of the Babylonians. They were given Babylonian names. They were made into eunuchs because they were going to serve in the king's palace. They were being indoctrinated into all of this stuff, trying to change them from Israelites to Babylonians. They were even encouraged to worship the god of the Babylonians. And in chapter 1, what we discover is that Daniel has found himself in a situation where they're supposed to eat the food that the king is giving them, but he knows that as an Israelite, this food is unclean. Now, it could have been because it was offered to idols. It could be because of the type of food it was. But whatever it was, Daniel asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow them not to eat that food so that they wouldn't be defiled. And he said, just test us. Give us vegetables, give us water for 10 days, see how that works out. And if we're healthy, then good. And if we're not, then you can do whatever you want. So they ate vegetables and water for 10 days, and they were more healthy than all of the others who were being trained at the time. And so God blessed them. And Daniel, in a very humble way, resisted what was being forced upon him. And he got permission to continue with that. But in chapter 2, we have another situation. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and he goes to his magicians, and he says, I need you to tell me what that dream means, but I also want you to tell me what that dream was. I'm not going to explain it to you, because I want to know, basically, what he wanted to know was whether they're going to be truthful with him or not. And they said, well, we can't do that. Nobody can do that. And finally, Daniel comes to him, because Nebuchadnezzar had decided he was going to kill all of the magicians, all of the astrologers, because they couldn't tell him what the dream was. And so Daniel comes to him, and he tells him that he will interpret the dream, and Nebuchadnezzar makes a comment about, oh, so you have the ability to interpret. But Daniel responds by saying, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And so Daniel is pointing to his God. And he's saying, I'm not the one who can do it, but my God in heaven is the one who can do it. In chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are told they're supposed to bow down to this idol. But they're unwilling to do it. The king has built this idol, had this idol built, and said, whenever the band plays, everybody bows down and worships it. But they said, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the God of gold that you have set up. Now, they don't know whether God will deliver them, but they know that he can. And even though they will be thrown into the furnace, they are not going to bow down. They're going to remain faithful. And so the king throws them into the furnace. They don't burn up. In fact, when the king looks, he sees that there's a fourth person. And he says it's someone that looks like the son of the gods. So maybe it's an angel. Maybe it's the angel of the Lord. We don't know. But it's clear that God is with them. And they are delivered. And so as you see Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go through all of these chapters, what you discover is they continue to have faith in God. They continue to point to God. They continue to help the kings to see who God is. And we discover that the kings begin to acknowledge God. They praise God. And that brings us to chapter 5. Chapter 5 is where Mitch was last week, and it was at the end of the Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar was gone, other kings have taken his place, and the one who is left is Belshazzar. Now, Belshazzar was not a good king. We learned about his arrogance and his pride last week, and Mitch talked about how the city of Babylon was overcome by the Persians. Now, what we see is that Darius the Mede is the one who took over the kingdom of Babylon. But those of you who know your history may remember that the history books say that Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon. And so the question is, who's Darius? Well, chapter 9 mentions him again. It says the first year of Darius, son of Xerxes, and I think this is where Mitch is going next week in chapter 9, a Mede by descendant who was made ruler over the Babylonian kingdom. Now, the different ideas about who Darius is, some say that it's another name for Cyrus. Some say that Darius is a title for Cyrus. The name Darius means Lord. So maybe that's what it is. Xerxes is a title for the kings as well in Persia. So maybe that's what it is. But maybe what it is that Cyrus conquered the kingdom of Babylon and then placed Darius as the king over Babylon. That makes more sense to me Because think about this. The Persian Empire was a whole lot larger than Babylon. And Cyrus can't be everywhere at once. And so that's kind of where I lean. Whatever the explanation is, Darius is the one who is now in charge and things are about to change. So as Darius becomes the new king, it says it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom. Now, a satrap is like a governor. So somebody that's over a province or something like that, over a state. So he has 120 satraps, and with 3 administrators over them, and one of whom was Daniel. So Daniel becomes one of the administrators over all the satraps over Babylon. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. So they were supposed to collect taxes and stuff like that, make sure the king got what he was supposed to get. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So Daniel is a good leader. He's a good administrator. He's a good organizer. He is somebody you can count on. And the king sees this, and he decides, I want to put him over everything, take a little bit of load off myself. Well, not everybody liked that idea. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. But they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. So not only did the king realize that Daniel is trustworthy, that he is a man of integrity, but these officials also knew that as well. Now they seemed to be jealous. They didn't want Daniel to be in charge. Why was the king not putting me in charge? They didn't like the fact that Daniel was moving up like this. And so they wanted to trip him up. They wanted him to fail. But they couldn't find a way to do it. And then finally, the wise men said, we'll never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it is something to do with the law of his God. So the only way that they're going to be able to catch Daniel, if they make sure that there is a conflict between his faith and the law of the Persians. They have to create that conflict somehow. Because they know that Daniel is a man of faith. Everybody knew it. It was something that you could count on for Daniel. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever." The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and the governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except for you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. Are they telling the truth? No, because obviously not all of the satraps and administrators agreed to this. Daniel obviously didn't, right? I don't even know if they talked to him about it. It's possible that if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are still around, that they didn't agree to it either. It's possible that there might even be some others who like Daniel who didn't agree to it. But they come to the king and they say, everybody's agreed to it. All of the officials have agreed to it. We think this would be a great idea. Just for 30 days. Just do it for 30 days. People have to pray to you. So now your majesty issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Now, whether it's the fact that the Medes and Persians were so connected to law, and law was so important to them that any law that was put into place, they just didn't want to disobey it, or whether it was something else, the practice for them at that point was once the king has put something into law, it has to happen. You can't change it. And so the king listens to them. If everybody else thinks it's a good idea, it sounds like a good idea to me. I mean, it sounds like a good idea at the time, right? Have you ever had a good idea that sounded like it was a good idea at the time? And then later on it wasn't? I knew this kid in high school. He thought it would be a good idea to drive up and down the street and throw firecrackers at other people until he didn't get the firecracker out of the car in time. It sounded like a good idea at the time. My mom was cooking dinner one night, and I don't know what we had to eat that night, but I know what we had to eat the night before. The night before it was hot dogs, because she tended to broil them in the oven. And I guess we didn't eat all the hot dogs the night before because there were still a couple left, and when she heated everything up, the hot dogs caught on fire. So what do you do if there's a fire? You put it out. Yeah, you throw water on it, right? That wasn't a good idea. Because when that happened, the flame, it just exploded. The flames went up all the wall and up to the ceiling, and then it went out, but the ceiling was black, and the wall was black, the oven was black. Fortunately, we weren't burnt, but it sounded like a good idea at the time, right? And it left the stain that was up there, so those things that seem like they're good ideas, sometimes they're not, and then there are consequences as a result of it. Do you remember as a child, or have you ever had a child that was at the edge of a staircase and they decided they wanted to look through the railing and they got their head stuck? It sounded like a good idea, and then you can't get your head out. Sometimes when we have those, it sounds like a good idea at the time moments, we find ourselves stuck. And what happens is Darius found himself stuck in a situation, we'll find out later, that he couldn't get out of, and there were consequences that he didn't intend. So now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had always done. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they set Daniel up, because they knew what Daniel typically did was he would go 3 times a day and pray toward Jerusalem with the windows open. Now, Daniel wasn't flaunting his faith. He wasn't trying to force his prayer on anybody else. He was just praying like he always did. Now, when this decree came out, Daniel had a choice to make. He had a choice to make. He could have prayed, right? He could have prayed silently. He could have gone into his closet. Jesus told us to do that. Close the windows, go into your closet, pray, don't let anybody hear you. That's not what he did. He could have reasoned to say, you know what, I can take a break for 30 days. God still knows that I care about him, that I want to follow him, and just not prayed for 30 days. But he didn't do that either. What he did was he continued the same practices that he had followed before. He continued the same habits, the same rhythm. Without forcing it on anyone else, just praying to his God. And these men knew when he would be praying, and they got enough witnesses together so that they could catch him in this, and that he hopefully would fall. You see, our faith is going to be tested. Our faith is going to be tested. If we have faith in God, it's going to be tested in some form or fashion. The question is, will we pass the test, and will we honor God above all else? Daniel was willing to do whatever was necessary to pass the test and to honor God above all else. Now, that got him into some trouble, and it could be that can get us into trouble too. And the thing is, if it does, it's really okay. It's really okay. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. So the king suddenly realizes this was not a good idea. I didn't intend for this to happen to Daniel. And so he's trying to figure out, how can I maneuver things in such a way to get Daniel off the hook? And the thing is, he can't do it because he can't revoke that law. And there are witnesses. Daniel's stuck. The king is stuck. And in addition to that, as he was trying to figure this out, those men come back to the king. And they say, you remember you wrote this law and you can't repeal it. You've got to put Daniel to death. Do you think the king is starting to figure out that I've been manipulated here? That these guys have tricked me into this? And these guys thought it was a good idea too, but they're going to find out later it wasn't. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you." Daniel knew that, Darius knew that Daniel continued to serve God, that he would continually serve God, that he was a man of faith in the living God. And he was hoping that this God would rescue Daniel. Now, when they took him and put him in the lion's den, threw him down into the hole, they rolled a stone over the opening, and the king's seal was put on the stone. And the nobles' seals were put on the stone, so nobody could open it until the next morning. And then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without entertainment being brought to him, and he couldn't sleep. He was worried to death. He was agonizing over this. He couldn't sleep. But who do you think did sleep? I would guess that Daniel probably could have slept. It doesn't tell us that he slept. And the lions, and this is where everybody starts singing. Yeah. Ooh, yeah. Okay. I know that some of you were waiting for that, right? So the king worried about Daniel, and then the next morning, it says at the first light of dawn, the king got up and he hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" He was hoping that he would have rescued him. And Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." What do you notice about this? Who was with Daniel? Angel. Daniel was not alone. God rescued him. Just like he was with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he was with Daniel. And the king suddenly realizes that this God has power. He's seen it for himself. Our faith is going to be tested. It will. But God's going to be with us. We see that time and time again, not just in the story of Daniel, but we see that in other stories in Scripture. That God is with his people. And then what happens after Daniel is rescued? Those who were his enemies, who tricked the king, they and their families were suddenly thrown into the lion's den, and they lost their lives. It sounded like a good idea at the time, but it wasn't, was it? Now, the king's response to all this is what a decree sends out to the kingdom. It says, "I issue a decree that in every part of the kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." Now, can you imagine the power that this statement has for the kingdom? Daniel didn't even have to say this. But because of Daniel's life, because of his humility in serving the kingdom of Babylon, and also in serving his God, King Darius is the one who makes this statement. And everybody knows that Daniel follows a God who is a living God. Our faith is going to be tested, but when we're found faithful, God's going to be honored and we will be saved. God will be honored, and we will be saved. But some of you may be thinking, wait a minute, it doesn't always happen that way, does it? Are there people who are tested in their faith and they actually lose their lives? There are. Are there people who suffer and they wonder where God is? Sure. Does it mean that God's not with them? No. God's still with them. Have you ever read chapter 11 of Hebrews? What is that? The great hall of fame of faith? You remember that? And it lists all these people, and it says, without faith it is impossible to please God. And it lists people like Abraham and Noah and Moses and Elijah, people who had done great things through their faith in God. How God had delivered them and had powerfully shown who he was. And it goes on to talk about how there were those who were delivered from the mouths of lions, and those who were delivered from the flames, and those who had dead people brought back to life. There were great things that God did through the lives of people who showed their faith. But as you continue to read that chapter, you see that it also says, and there were some who were persecuted, and some who were thrown into prison, and some who lost their lives by being stoned to death by others, and who were stabbed with swords and died, and who were sawed in two. People who were thrown into prison, who suffered greatly, who were tortured because of their faith. And it says the world was not worthy of these. What Hebrews 11 does is it gives us an honest picture of the fact that when we're faithful, for some of us, we're delivered from the den of the lions, and for others, we may not be. Even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that God could deliver them from the fiery furnace, but they didn't know if he would. And it didn't matter whether he did or didn't. They were going to still be faithful. So we live with this dichotomy. Is God going to rescue us? Is God going to save us? The truth is, we'll always be rescued on some level. I like the way that Philip Yancey talks about this chapter in his book, Meet the Bible. It's a devotional book that he has. He says, the picture of faith that emerges from this chapter in Hebrews 11 does not fit into an easy formula. Sometimes faith leads to victory and triumph. Sometimes it requires a gritty determination to hang on at any cost. Hebrews 11 does not hold up one kind of faith as superior to the other. Both rest in the belief that God is in ultimate control and will indeed keep his promises, whether that happens in this life or in the next. Of such people, Hebrews says God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. You see, the thing is that whether God rescues us from the lion's den or whether he doesn't, we will be saved. That we will eventually be rescued, either in this life or in the next. That's what faith does for us. It helps us to remind us of those things. And it doesn't make him any less God if he doesn't rescue us from that situation in this life. So I don't know where you guys are at. I would imagine that some of you are being tested, that there are struggles that you're facing, whether it has to do with health issues or whether it has to do with relationships or whether it has to do with work or whether it has to do with something else. But it could be that your faith is being tested. What I want you to know is that God still cares about you and you're not alone. What I want you to know is that he is still there for you. And that whether you are rescued in this life or the next, you will be rescued. That there is hope, there is salvation, and that's for you. So if there's any way that we can help and encourage you, to pray with you, or maybe you want to make a decision to follow Christ today and to be baptized into him, we're here for you. And we hope that you'll let us know. Please do that as we stand and sing.